Welcome to East and West, Season 4, Episode 2, an audiobook presentation of Undine by Friedrich de la Motte Fouqué. If you are joining us for the first time, I strongly advise starting Season 4 at the beginning, which will be Season 4, Episode 1. Otherwise, here we go, Undine, Chapter 1. In this chapter, we meet our central characters, an old fisherman and his wife, their adopted daughter, the title character Undine, a strange girl from the first, and a knight named Huldbrand, who makes this, for now, a stranger comes to town story. Chapter 1. On a beautiful evening, many hundred years ago, a worthy old fisherman sat mending his nets. The spot where he dwelt was exceedingly picturesque. The green turf on which he had built his cottage ran far out into a great lake, and this slip of verdure appeared to stretch into it as much through love of its clear waters as the lake, moved by a like impulse, strove to fold the meadow, with its waving grass and flowers, and the cooling shade of the trees, in its embrace of love. They seemed to be drawn toward each other, and the one to be visiting the other as a guest. With respect to human beings, indeed, in this pleasant spot, excepting the fisherman and his family, there were few, or rather none, to be met with. For as in the background of the scene, toward the west and northwest, lay a forest of extraordinary wildness, which, owing to its sunless gloom and almost impassable recesses, as well as to fear of the strange creatures and visionary illusions to be encountered in it, most people avoided entering, unless in cases of extreme necessity. The pious old fisherman, however, many times passed through it without harm, when he carried the fine fish which he caught by his beautiful strip of land to a great city, lying only a short distance beyond. Now, the reason he was able to go through this wood with so much ease may have been chiefly this, because he entertained scarcely any thoughts but such as were of a religious nature. And besides, every time he crossed the evil-reported shades, he used to sing some holy song with a clear voice and from a sincere heart. Well, while he sat by his nets this evening, neither fearing nor devising evil, a sudden terror seized him, as he heard a rushing in the darkness of the wood that resembled the tramping of a mounted steed, and the noise continued every instant, drawing nearer and nearer to his little territory. What he had fancied, when abroad in many a stormy night, respecting the mysteries of the forest, now flashed through his mind in a moment, especially the figure of a man of gigantic stature and snow-white appearance, who kept nodding his head in a portentous manner. And when he raised his eyes towards the wood, the form came before him in perfect distinctness, as he saw the nodding man burst forth from the mazy webwork of leaves and branches. But he immediately felt emboldened when he reflected that nothing to give him alarm had ever befallen him, even in the forest, and moreover, that on this open neck of land the evil spirit, it was likely, would be still less daring in the exercise of his power. At the same time, he prayed aloud with the most earnest sincerity of devotion, repeating a passage of the Bible. This inspired him with fresh courage, and soon perceiving the illusion and the strange mistake into which his imagination had betrayed him, he could with difficulty refrain from laughing. The white, nodding figure he had seen became transformed in the twinkling of an eye to what it really was, a small brook, long and familiarly known to him, which ran foaming from the forest and discharged itself into the lake. But what had caused the startling sound was a knight, arrayed in sumptuous apparel, who from under the shadows of the trees came riding toward the cottage. His doublet was violet, embroidered with gold, and his scarlet cloak hung gracefully over it. On his cap of burnished gold waved red and violet-colored plumes, and in his golden shoulder belt flashed a sword richly ornamented and extremely beautiful. The white barb that bore the knight was more slenderly built than war horses usually are, and he touched the turf with a step so light and elastic that the green and flowery carpet seemed hardly to receive the slightest injury from his tread. The old fisherman, notwithstanding, did not feel perfectly secure in his mind, although he was forced to believe that no evil could be feared from an appearance so pleasing, and therefore, as good manners dictated, he took off his hat on the night's coming near, and quietly remained by the side of his nets. When the stranger stopped, and asked whether he, with his horse, could have shelter and entertainment for the night, the fisherman returned answer, "As to your horse, fair sir, I have no better stable for him than this shady meadow, and no better provender than the grass that is growing here. But with respect to yourself, you shall be welcome to our humble cottage, and to the best supper and lodging we are able to give you." The knight was well contented with this reception, and alighting from his horse, which his host assisted him to relieve from saddle and bridle, he let him hasten away to the fresh pasture, and thus spoke. "Even had I found you less hospitable and kindly disposed, my worthy old friend, you would still, I suspect, hardly have got rid of me today, for here, I perceive, a broad lake lies before us, and as to riding back into that wood of wonders, with the shades of evening deepening around me, may heaven in its grace preserve me from that thought." "Pray not a word of the wood, or of returning to it," said the fisherman, and took his guest into the cottage. There sat the fisherman's aged wife in a great chair. At the entrance of their noble guest, she rose and gave him a courteous welcome, but sat down again in her seat of honor, not making the slightest offer of it to the stranger. Upon this, the fisherman said with a smile, "You must not be offended with her, young gentleman, because she has not given up to you the best chair in the house. It is a custom among poor people to look upon this as the privilege of the aged." "Why, husband," cried the old lady with a quiet smile, "where can your wits be wandering? Our guest, to say the least of him, must belong to a Christian country, and how is it possible then that so well-bred a young man as he appears to be could dream of driving old people from their chairs? Take a seat, my young master," continued she, turning to the knight. "There is still quite a snug little chair on the other side of the room there. Only be careful not to shove it about too roughly, for one of its legs, I fear, is not of the firmest." The knight brought up the seat as carefully as she could desire, sat down upon it good-humoredly, and it seemed to him almost as if he must be somehow related to this little household, and have just returned home from abroad. These three worthy people now began to converse in the most friendly and familiar manner, in relation to the forest, indeed, concerning which the knight occasionally made some inquiries. The old man chose to know and say but little. He was of the opinion that slightly touching upon it at this hour of twilight was most suitable and safe. But of the cares and comforts of their home and their business abroad, the aged couple spoke more freely, and listened also with eager curiosity as the knight recounted to them his travels, and how he had a castle near one of the sources of the Danube, and that his name was Sir Huldbrand of Ringstetten. Already had the stranger, while they were in the midst of their talk, heard at times a splash against the little low window, as if someone were dashing water against it. The old man, every time he heard the noise, knit his brows with vexation, but at last, when the whole sweep of a shower came pouring like a torrent against the panes, and bubbling through the decayed frame into the room, he started up, indignant, rushed to the window, and cried with a threatening voice, "Undine, will you never leave off these fooleries? Not even today, when we have a stranger knight with us in the cottage?" All without now became still. Only a low laugh was just audible, and the fisherman said, as he came back to his seat, "You will have the goodness, my honoured guest, to pardon this accident, and it may be a multitude more, but she has no thought of evil or of any harm. This mischievous Undine, to confess the truth, is our adopted daughter, and she stoutly refuses to give over this frolicsome childishness of hers, although she has already entered her 18th year. But in spite of this, as I said before, she is at heart one of the very best children in the world." "You may say so," broke in the old lady, shaking her head. "You can give a better account of her than I can. When you return home from fishing, or from selling your fish in the city, you may think her frolics very delightful, but to have her dancing about you the whole day long, and never from morning to night to hear her speak one word of sense, And then, as she grows older, instead of having any help from her in the family, to find her a continual cause of anxiety, lest her wild humours should completely ruin us, that is quite another thing, and enough at last to weary out the patience even of a saint."
"Well, well," replied the master of the house with a smile, "you have your trials with Undine, and I have mine with the lake. The lake often beats down my dams and breaks the meshes of my nets, but for all that, I have a strong affection for it, and so have you, in spite of your mighty crosses and vexations, for our graceful little child. Is it not true?"
"One cannot be very angry with her," answered the old lady, as she gave her husband an approving smile. That instant the door flew open, and a fair girl of wondrous beauty sprang laughing in and said, "You have only been making a mock of me, father, for where now is the guest you mentioned?"
The same moment, however, she perceived the knight also, and continued standing before the young man in fixed astonishment. Huldbrand was charmed with her graceful figure, and viewed her lovely features with the more intense interest, as he imagined it was only her surprise that allowed him the opportunity, and that she would soon turn away from his gaze with increased bashfulness. But the event was the very reverse of what he expected, for after looking at him for a long while, she became more confident, moved nearer, knelt down before him, and while she played with a gold medal which he wore attached to a rich chain on his breast, exclaimed,
"Why, you beautiful, you kind guest, how have you reached our poor cottage at last? Have you been obliged for years and years to wander about the world before you could catch one glimpse of our nook? Do you come out of that wild forest, my beautiful knight?" The old woman was so prompt in her reproof as to allow him no time to answer. She commanded the maiden to rise, show better manners, and go to her work. But Undine, without making any reply, drew a little footstool near Huldbrand's chair, sat down upon it with her netting, and said in a gentle tone, "I will work here." The old man did as parents are apt to do with children to whom they have been overindulgent. He affected to observe nothing of Undine's strange behavior, and was beginning to talk about something else. But this the maiden did not permit him to do. She broke in upon him. "I have asked our kind guest from whence he has come among us, and he has not answered me." "I come out of the forest, you lovely little vision," Huldbrand returned, and she spoke again. "Oh, you must also tell me how you came to enter that forest so feared and shunned, and the marvelous adventures you met with in it, for there is no escaping without something of this kind." Huldbrand felt a slight shudder on remembering what he had witnessed, and looked involuntarily toward the window, for it seemed to him that one of the strange shapes which had come upon him in the forest must be there grinning in through the glass. But he discerned nothing except the deep darkness of night which had now enveloped the whole prospect. Upon this he became more collected, and was just on the point of beginning his account when the old man thus interrupted him. "Not so, Sir Knight, this is by no means a fit hour for such relations." But Undine, in a state of high excitement, sprang up from her little stool, and cried, placing herself directly before the fisherman, "He shall not tell his story, father! He shall not! But it is my will he shall! Stop him who may!" Thus speaking, she stamped her little foot vehemently on the floor, but all with an air of such comic and good-humored simplicity that Huldbrand now found it quite as hard to withdraw his gaze from her wild emotion as he had before from her gentleness and beauty. The old man, on the contrary, burst out in unrestrained displeasure. He severely reproved Undine for her disobedience and her unbecoming carriage towards the stranger, and his old good wife joined him in harping on the same string. By these rebukes Undine was only excited the more. "If you want to quarrel with me," she cried, "and will not let me hear what I so much desire, then sleep alone in your smoky old hut." And swift as an arrow she shot from the door and vanished amid the darkness of the night. Huldbrand and the fisherman sprang from their seats and were rushing to stop the angry girl, but before they could reach the cottage door, she had disappeared into the stormy darkness without, and no sound, not so much even as that of her light footstep, betrayed the course she had taken. Huldbrand threw a glance of inquiry towards his host, It almost seemed to him as if the whole of the sweet apparition, which had so suddenly plunged again amid the night, were no other than a continuation of the wonderful forms that had just played their mad pranks with him in the forest. But the old man muttered between his teeth, "This is not the first time she has treated us in this manner. Now must our hearts be filled with anxiety and our eyes find no sleep for a whole night. For who can assure us, in spite of her past escapes, that she will not some time or other come to harm, if she thus continue out in the dark and alone until daylight?" "Then pray, for God's sakes, father, let us follow her," cried Huldbrand anxiously.
"Wherefore should we?" replied the old man. "It would be a sin were I to suffer you all alone to search after the foolish girl amid the lonesomeness of the night, and my old limbs would fail to carry me to this wild rover, even if I knew to what place she has betaken herself."
"Still, we ought at least to call after her, and beg her to return," said Huldbrand, and he began to call in tones of earnest entreaty, "Undine! Undine! Come back! Come back!" The old man shook his head and said, "All your shouting, however loud and long, will be of no avail. You know not as yet, Sir Knight, how self-willed the little thing is." But still, even hoping against hope, he could not himself cease calling out every minute amid the gloom of night, "Undine! Ah, dear Undine, I beseech you, pray come back, only this once." It turned out, however, exactly as the fisherman had said. No Undine could they hear or see, and as the old man would on no account consent that Huldbrand should go in quest of the fugitive, they were both obliged at last to return into the cottage. There they found the fire almost gone out, and the mistress of the house, who took Undine's flight and danger far less to heart than her husband, had already gone to rest. The old man blew up the coals, put on dry wood, and by the firelight hunted for a flask of wine, which he brought and set between himself and his guest. "You, Sir Knight, as well as I," said he, "are anxious on the silly girl's account, and it would be better, I think, to spend part of the night in chatting and drinking than keep turning and turning on our rush mats and trying in vain to sleep. What is your opinion?" Huldbrand was well pleased with the plan. The fisherman pressed him to take the empty seat of honor, its late occupant having now left it for her couch, and they relished their beverage and enjoyed their chat as two such good men and true ever ought to do. To be sure, whenever the slightest thing moved before the windows, or at times when even nothing was moving, one of them would look up and exclaim, "Here she comes!" And then would they continue silent a few moments, and afterwards, when nothing appeared, would shake their heads, breathe out a sigh, and go on with their talk.
But, as neither could think of anything but Undine, the best plan they could devise was that the old fisherman should relate and the knight should hear in what manner Undine had come to the cottage. So the fisherman began as follows.
"It is now about 15 years since I one day crossed the wild forest with fish for the city market. My wife had remained at home as she was wont to do, and at this time for a reason of more than common interest, for although we were beginning to feel the advances of age, God had bestowed upon us an infant of wonderful beauty. It was a little girl, and we already began to ask ourselves the question whether we ought not, for the advantage of the newcomer, to quit our solitude, and the better to bring up this precious gift of heaven, to remove to some more inhabited place. Poor people, to be sure, cannot in these cases do all you may think they ought, Sir Knight, but we must all do what we can. Well, I went on my way, and this affair would keep running in my head. This land was most dear to me, and I trembled when amidst the bustle and broils of the city I thought to myself, in a scene of tumult like this, or at least in one not much more quiet, I must soon take up my abode. But I did not for this murmur against our good God. On the contrary, I praised him in silence for the new-born babe. I should also speak an untruth were I to say that anything befell me, either on my passage through the forest to the city, or on my returning homeward, that gave me more alarm than usual, as at that time I had never seen any appearance there which could terrify or annoy me. The Lord was ever with me in those awful shades." Thus speaking, he took his cap reverently from his bald head, and continued to sit for a considerable time in devout thought. He then covered himself and went on with his relation. On this side of the forest, alas, it was on this side that woe burst upon me. My wife came wildly to meet me, clad in mourning apparel, and her eyes streaming with tears. Gracious God, I cried, where's our child? Speak. With him on whom you have called, dear husband, she answered. And we now entered the cottage together, weeping in silence. I looked for the little corpse, almost fearing to find what I was seeking, and then it was I first learnt how all had happened. My wife had taken the little one in her arms and walked out to the shore of the lake. She there sat down by its very brink, and while she was playing with the infant, as free from all fear as she was full of delight, it bent forward on a sudden, as if seeing something very beautiful in the water. My wife saw her laugh, the dear angel, and tried to catch the image in her tiny hands. But in a moment, with a motion swifter than sight, she sprang from her mother's arms and sank into the lake, the watery glass into which she had been gazing. I searched for our lost darling again and again, but it was all in vain. I could nowhere find the least trace of her. The same evening, we, childless parents, were sitting together. We had no desire to talk, even if our tears would have permitted us. As we thus sat in mournful stillness, gazing into the fire, all at once we heard something without, a slight rustling at the door. The door flew open, and we saw a little girl, 3 or 4 years old, and more beautiful than I can say, standing on the threshold, richly dressed and smiling upon us. We were struck dumb with astonishment, and I knew not for a time whether the tiny form were a real human being or a mere mockery of enchantment. But I soon perceived water dripping from her golden hair and rich garments, and that the pretty child had been lying in the water, and stood in immediate need of our help. Wife, said I, no one has been able to save our child for us, but let us do for others what would have made us so blessed could anyone have done it for us. We undressed the little thing, put her to bed, gave her something to drink. At all this, she spoke not a word, but only turned her eyes upon us, eyes blue and bright as sea or sky, and continued looking at us with a smile. Next morning we had no reason to fear that she had received any other harm than her wetting, and I now asked her about her parents, and how she could have come to us. But the account she gave was both confused and incredible. She must surely have been born far from here, not only because I have been unable for these 15 years to learn anything of her birth, but because she then said, and at times continues to say, many things of so very singular a nature that we neither of us know, after all, whether she may not have dropped among us from the moon. For her talk runs upon golden castles, crystal domes, and heaven knows what extravagances beside. What, however, she related with most distinctness was this, that while she was once taking a sail with her mother on the great lake, she fell out of the boat into the water, and that when she first recovered her senses, she was here, under our trees, where the gay scenes of the shore filled her with delight. We now had another care weighing upon our minds, and one that caused us no small perplexity and uneasiness. We, of course, very soon determined to keep and bring up the child we had found, in place of our own darling that had been drowned. But who could tell us whether she had been baptized or not? She herself could give us no light on the subject. When we asked her the question, she commonly made answer that she well knew she was created for God's praise and glory, and that she was willing to let us do with her all that might promote his glory and praise. My wife and I reasoned in this way. If she has not been baptized, there can be no use in putting off the ceremony. And if she has been, it still is better to have too much of a good thing than too little. Taking this view of our difficulty, we now endeavored to hit upon a good name for the child, since while she remained without one, we were often at a loss in our familiar talk to know what to call her. We at length agreed that Dorothea would be most suitable for her, as I had somewhere heard it said that this name signified a gift from God, and surely she had been sent to us by Providence as a gift, to comfort us in our misery. She, on the contrary, would not so much as hear Dorothea mentioned. She insisted that as she had been named Undine by her parents, Undine she ought still to be called. It now occurred to me that this was a heathenish name, to be found in no calendar, and I resolved to ask the advice of a priest in the city. He would not listen to the name of Undine, and yielding to my urgent request, he came with me through the enchanted forest in order to perform the rite of baptism here in my cottage. The little maid stood before us so prettily adorned, and with such an air of gracefulness, that the heart of the priest softened at once in her presence, and she coaxed him so sweetly, and jested with him so merrily, that he at last remembered nothing of his many objections to the name of Undine. Thus, then, was she baptized, Undine, and during the holy ceremony she behaved with great propriety and gentleness, wild and wayward as at other times she invariably was. For in this my wife was quite right, when she mentioned the anxiety the child has occasioned us. If I should relate to you at this moment, the knight interrupted the fisherman to direct his attention to a deep sound as of a rushing flood, which had caught his ear during the talk of the old man. And now the waters came pouring on with redoubled fury before the cottage windows. Both sprang to the door. There they saw, by the light of the now risen moon, the brook which issued from the wood rushing wildly over its banks, and whirling onward with it both stones and branches of trees in its rapid course. The storm, as if awakened by the uproar, burst forth from the clouds, whose immense masses of vapor coursed over the moon with the swiftness of thought. The lake roared beneath the wind that swept the foam from its waves, while the trees of this narrow peninsula groaned from root to topmost branch as they bowed and swung above the torrent. "Undine! In God's name, Undine!" cried the two men in an agony. No answer was returned, and now, regardless of everything else, they hurried from the cottage, one in this direction, the other in that, searching and calling. A few thoughts after Chapter 1. Now we've seen the tragedy of the old couple's first child, lost to the lake, then the rejuvenation of their new child, Undine, adopted into their family, then the relapsing sorrow of Undine's waywardness and uncontrollable spirit, a grief more than a few parents have known in the waking world. Also we see the knight Huldbrand come from out of the forest, seeking refuge from the dangers in the wood, and more than a little interested, it seems clear, in this adopted daughter, this Undine. I hope you'll join us for the next installment, which is Chapter 2. Until then, press on, everybody.